get kind of curious with the fact that the camera receives a little bit of a better audio than the voice recorder app, which I guess kind of makes sense because in this case, if it takes video, even if the Bluetooth is attached to the car, it does it through the phone's microphone versus the telephone feature microphone, if that makes sense. Anyhow, I am speaking, I'm going to say trying to speak as calmly as I possibly can because I'm so attuned to the fast rate that social media has had on the way that my mind works, frankly, and without a doubt, I would say the way that it has caused listeners to pay attention to things as well. We're being conditioned to be less patient. So now that I got that out of the way, what I want to talk about is a few things. I think I'm going to focus on just one right now, though, because I think two things might be slightly different subjectivity and for another video entirely. Those two things are, one, I want to talk about conditioning, inheritance, and mostly conditioning, but what that looks like in the context of culture, and specifically within the culture of mainstream church congregation culture. I want you, first of all, to keep in mind when I say mainstream, not to disclude yourself from that when you listen to that, right? I know what I'm saying when I say mainstream, and you may think you know what I'm saying when I say mainstream, but we come to find we are much more mainstream than we suspect. That's why we need to think about the deeper things. Okay, so, right, first, conditioning, somewhat of inheritance. The second thing, which I believe I will talk about later, I hope to, has to do with something else. I forgot. Well, for the better, because I'm here to focus on one thing, right? Okay, so conditioning. You go to church, and the message is, you're a sinner. And your response to that is, I am a sinner, because you told me I'm a sinner. Now, the question is, who told you you're a sinner? If they did, why? That's sort of the abstract to what I'm about to get at. Okay, so you go to church, and this is the mainstream church congregation, and the typical message for the audience, the listeners, the receivers of this message is, you are a sinner. Okay. Great. What is the biblical context to that? Right. Well, in the first letter of John, we read that anyone that denies that they have sinned is a liar, right? But we also read that anyone that sins is not doing the will of God, but the will of the devil. So this message, you are a sinner, is strongly veering toward the first part of that reference in 1 John, right? You know, if you deny that you're a sinner, then you are lying to yourself and to God. Great. Okay, so, you know, you read that and you say, okay, I can't deny that I have sinned. But you need to read this in context, because it being paired with somebody that is denying that they have sin versus somebody confessing that they have sin and relying on the propitiation, which is the word in that letter, propitiation, that Jesus Christ covers by his blood, being the advocate to us at the right hand of the Father. It's to recognize that you have sin when you do, and you don't deny it, and you have room for confession, right? If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us, right? And God does that through his Son. Okay, so that's the message that's sort of extrapolated and taught in congregations. You are a sinner. Okay. And remember, I asked, why do you say that at the start in my abstract, right? Which we'll get to. But let's stay here for a second on the first chapter of the first letter of John, where it says that those that do evil are of the father, the devil for them, of their father, the devil, right? There's God the Father, and there's the devil, who those that sin, whenever they do, are sons of the devil, right? It's really just as plain black and white as that. Why is it written this way when we know that Jesus said, you know, that it's going to happen, that, you know, things are going to happen, that you're going to trip, right? Jesus is not telling you to trip, right? He's saying, because we live in a fallen world, it's somewhat inevitable that you are going to trip, right? And what is tripping versus jumping off a cliff, right? That's the difference here. The jumping off a cliff is the blatant sin, and the tripping is the accidents that happen along the way, right? That's what Jesus is saying, you know. So those that transgress, right, that jump off the cliff, are doing the things that are evil of their father, the devil, right? That's the distinction. Now, back to what I was saying in my abstract, close this for a second, is why are you telling me I am a sinner, right? If I were to ask the sort of system of the church congregation leaders, why do you say I am a sinner? There are various factors that are taught within church congregations to keep people in their seats, in their buildings, in community, and in their pockets. That's the best way I can sum it up. I'm going to get into this. If sin is not correctly taught, it can be used in the general, wider congregational sense as a manipulating factor to keep people in continual sin. what would cause me to say that? One significant sin that is prevalent in mainstream Christian congregation culture is the sin of adultery. The sin of adultery being both the blatant, literal sin of adulterous activity taking place in between persons in a marriage, and the continued mindset of pornographic reliance, which is sort of a broader system, right? That's sort of outside of the system of the mainstream church congregation culture, which is a worldly thing, right? Pornography comes from the word porneia, which means fornication, which really just means sex without honor. And the way that mainstream church congregation culture can tap into that, which is a broader realm, is really not cutting off the hand that causes that sin, and not teaching to cut off the hand that causes that sin. There is no strict or playful, light gestures toward this kind of activity in mainstream Christian congregation. This was a thing probably more often the case about 5 to 10 years ago. I'd say it's still prevalent. It's not as often spoken about. It's kind of hidden, right? It's a hidden thing. And while I don't have all the ideas as how it's been prevailing, which I plan to look into, it's still very much a thing in just terms of the attitude of church leaders treating this sort of sin of fornication lightly. Okay, so there's that aspect. Now back to adultery. And just keep in mind what I'm saying too about the manipulation of the perception of sin, keeping people in their seats. Just keep that in mind. It's rough, it's hard, it's tough to talk about, right? You know, I'm surrounded by it at this very moment. You know, there's a strong pressure that keeps you engaged to be continually made blind. Adultery is defined in the Bible as very clearly in the teachings of Jesus, Matthew chapter 5, where he's talking about adultery at the heart, which is what I was saying about pornography, fornication, and adultery, the blatant kind. And Jesus does lay it out very clearly. He also discusses fornication, right? Which cheating can be a form of fornication. But Jesus lays out the reality of adulterous sins, in that if a woman is divorced from her husband and marries another man, that woman is an adulteress. And Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife causes his wife to become an adulteress. And whoever marries a divorced woman is an adulterer, right? That's adultery. Adultery, at its most basic term, is the mixing of chemicals, making something impure, it's like, I mean, look, God made all things, and food is good, right? All things are meant to be enjoyed. But I'm going to bring in alcohol into the sense, right? Because alcohol is an agent that has an effect on people, right? It's like having lemonade that's spiked, right? You want lemonade at its purest sense, non-alcoholic, virgin, so to say, virgin in terms of purity, is lemon. Maybe you add sugar or some kind of sweetener, honey, and whatever natural ingredients that you want to put into that specific mixed drink, right? Lemonade, just a basic lemonade though, is lemon, sweetener, and water, right? Those are the 3 basic ingredients for lemonade, right? But adultery is introducing a new chemical, and I'm using alcohol in the sense to where it's something very foreign, right? Something that does something much more and without the original intent. You add in the alcohol and it becomes spiked. Okay, you could have a spiked lemonade, sure. But then you keep adding further agents, and you just keep mixing it. The lemon, it starts to lose its flavor. The sweet becomes more bitter. It's just, there's a dichotomy of these things, right? There's the difference between sweet and bitter, right and wrong, light and dark, and these things factor into mixtures as well. Adultery, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Okay, so all of that to say, there is the teaching in contemporary mainstream Christian congregation culture that says you can divorce your partner if they have cheated on you. That is not what Jesus said. Jesus did not permit divorce. And when he's explaining about divorce, he's not giving commandment on divorce. He's saying what defines a person as an adulterer. That's what he's saying, right? And he uses the terms divorced with people that are currently undergoing that process, right? Or have undergone that process, to bring to the reality that your marriage is sacred, that it is God that brought you together, and that there is no man, none, that can break that asunder. But the church, mainstream, contemporary culture, and I'm not talking about every church, I'm just saying it's very popular, continues to teach that it's okay to have a divorce, that you can have multiple wives, because there was a woman that Jesus spoke to, at the well, that had multiple husbands. No. Jesus found her at her present tense, right? Jesus finds you at your present tense. And if you find yourself to be a sinner and you deny it, you are lying to yourself and you are lying to God. But this continual sort of translational error that is taught very popularly within mainstream church congregation culture keeps people looking, for new partners in the same realm. It keeps people going back to their church. And the fact that people are being recognized as sinners, right? You're a sinner. You committed adultery, or you're divorced. You're continuing to watch pornography. The fact that you are continually being recognized as that is not putting an end to your sin, which Jesus, in saying, cut your right hand off if it prevents you from getting into heaven. The church is sort of maybe gnawing at it with like a plastic knife, and then just saying, okay, it's fine, and then just like patting it with like an alcoholic cleaning pad. It's doing nothing for your sin, and it's doing nothing, frankly, for your soul. And you need to recognize that there is a larger systemic issue troubling your soul more than you think. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. Thanks for listening. Bye.